So as a result, it's probably one of the last to be impacted. So now, how is it getting impacted is kind of the question. And so I'm sure a lot of you have heard just recently that Pfizer and Wyeth are starting to undergo a mega merger between the two, and certainly American Sharing Plow is another company, or another two companies that are starting to do mega mergers. And what's kind of driving that is the fact that the pipelines, meaning the drugs that these big pharmaceutical companies have that's sitting in development, is actually very shallow. And by that, it means they don't have a lot of drugs in their pipeline. And so what they really are focusing on as a revenue source is what is already in the market. So the drugs that are already being sold in the market, like Lipitor or Viagra, you've all heard about, but these drugs that are blockbuster drugs, the vast majority of them are actually going off patent. It's predicted by 2013, it's safe to say about 85% of the billion-dollar-a-year drugs are going off patent. Okay, so for pharmaceutical companies, what that means is that the large margins that they derive on the sale of these pharmaceuticals will collapse to very, very thin margins. And the reason for that is that once a patent expires, the drugs go generic. Once they're generic, then anybody can make the drugs. And what will happen is that you get price competition. And so the drug prices start to plummet. And because they plummet, the margins on those drugs actually become very small. So when that happens, the big pharma companies' share prices start to go down, right? So now Wall Street's pressuring big pharma keep share prices up, and the only way they can try to keep share prices up is by acquiring new technology. And where do they turn for new technology? But biotech. So biotechnology is really kind of the engine of innovation for a lot of these pharmaceutical companies that have failed to innovate over the years. And so the model of the industry is typically, technology comes out of the university. We can back up and say that your tax dollars, right? So your tax dollars go towards funding institutions like the NIH, the National Cancer Institute, National Science Foundation, places like that. And what the government does is it basically gives dollars to universities and others that apply for grants. And with that grant money, they use it to create new technology. And then from that new technology, it gets licensed out of the universities into the biotech companies. And what Boston is really kind of famous for, nowhere else, well, I won't say nowhere else in the world, but there are very few cities in the world that compete with Boston on the innovation front. And so when you look at the number of startup biotechs, Boston is really kind of has the highest concentration of new startup companies. And so that's where a lot of the job creation comes from, is around startups. Once these companies kind of start and they start, their research process and they start to move down the drug development pathway, then what happens is when they get to a critical point in drug development, it's called a phase 2 clinical trial, right? So a lot of times you'll hear in the news that a company's drug didn't pass a particular phase in clinical trials, and typically the stock drops, right? And so what's happening is that these companies, their clinical trials kind of make or break the company. So if you're successful at around phase 2, which means that you've taken a drug, you've taken a patient population, you've broken it in half. One half of the population you give the drug, the other half of the population you're given what's called a placebo, right? And you're not telling either group what they're getting, so nobody really knows whether it's a treatment or a placebo. And then after the end of the clinical trial, you try to see, is there a real measurable effect in improvement in health? So it's called an outcome. And so if outcomes are good, then again, the stock jumps up for these biotech companies and starts to create value for the biotechs. And that starts to hire more people again, because now they're really kind of moving towards thinking about commercial launch, meaning taking their drug out of development and starting to think about how to bring it to the marketplace. And at about that time is when big pharmaceutical companies become very attracted to those companies, because from their perspective, the biotech company has taken all the risk, okay, so financial risk, technical risk, regulatory risk, and I'll even say, risk along the lines of whether or not they'll even be viable as companies. And so for the pharma company, that's a good deal. So you'll see a lot of these mergers and acquisitions that are going on in the field. And so a lot of big, I'm just thinking, it was probably the one that you heard about most recently. Roche is trying to buy Genentech. Right? So Genentech was funded heavily by Roche. I think Roche owned a 49% share of the company. And now that Genentech has become so highly successful, Roche sees it in its interest to try to acquire the company in whole to kind of bolster its pipeline, right? It's all about keeping that pipeline full. And that's what kind of keeps big pharmaceutical companies in business, keeps the earnings up, and so that Wall Street's happy. So that's the ecosystem of the whole thing. So now, with the financial collapse that's going on out there, the problem is that, so on the one hand, you have big pharmaceutical companies who don't have the pipeline to try to keep things going. And on the other hand, you have the market, sorry about that. On the other hand, you have private equity markets and venture capital and folks like that who are afraid to invest in new companies because they're just now risk averse. And so because they're risk averse, a lot of the biotech companies can't raise the capital to now, start operations with their companies. And so the real fear right now in the marketplace is, well, how long is this credit freeze going to last? Because the biotech industry can only operate for so long before it too runs out of cash. And so that's the big question. I was at a conference 2 days ago, and that was really kind of the big topic. Is like, when will you, as investors, start to put money back into the system? And at this conference, they had 4 or 5 Wall Street guys, and people were asking them questions. And what they're saying is that until the general marketplace actually has a level of comfort that people are willing to put money back into the market and invest, you will see that the trickle-down effect is that people won't want to put money in what are called small or micro-cap companies. So these are the small biotechs. And because they're afraid to put money in micro-caps, the system is frozen as far as funding small biotech companies. And so I think what will probably happen is that over the next 6 or 7 months, as the market gets a little bit more relaxed and the fear has gone, and people are generally starting to feel more comfortable about investing in banks or lending and all that kind of stuff, you'll start to see money start to flow into the microcaps as well. But it's still a little ways off. So it's kind of a gloom and doom picture right now. But the bright side of it is that everybody gets sick, everybody gets old, and sooner or later you all need medicine. So what's going to end up happening is that you'll see that the engine that's kind of seized will kind of get unstuck because people will realize that you need biotech, you need innovation, and you really need to get new drugs into development into the market. So that's kind of a nutshell where things are. So how does this all relate to getting a job? Is kind of the big question. Why you're all here. So I'll start off with the general proposition that getting a job in biotech and getting a job in pharmaceuticals are probably slightly different because I think that pharmaceuticals you can really kind of go with a general marketing degree or a general finance degree and get yourself into a pharmaceutical company and develop a body of expertise. Biotech is a little